arrived on a stormy evening, the portal snapping shut behind them with an unnatural hum that lingered in the air longer than usual. Rick adjusted his portal gun with a frown, muttering under his breath about interference from cross-dimensional energy spikes. Morty, pale and hesitant, stared at the towering silhouette before them. A mansion nestled in the hills of a long-abandoned Earth variant known as C-137 Black. This wasn't their home dimension, but it bore unsettling similarities. The sky hung low, swollen with clouds that never moved. Trees twisted like skeletal fingers, their leaves an eerie shade of gray-green. The mansion itself was impossibly large, its architecture a grotesque fusion of Victorian decay and futuristic embellishments. Its windows glowed faintly, not with light, but with something older, more aware. Rick claimed they were here to retrieve a data crystal he'd once hidden during a war with the Council of Ricks. But as they entered, the house greeted them with a groan, its walls shifting subtly, as if the structure had been waiting to awaken. The hallways were impossibly long. Rooms appeared and vanished when no one was looking. Portraits on the walls depicted warped versions of Rick and Morty, some with empty eyes, others with mouths where eyes should be. The air thickened the deeper they went, pressing in with a weight that didn't belong in a world bound by physics. It didn't take long for time to begin unraveling. They split up, not by choice, but by force. One moment, Morty was behind Rick. The next, he was gone, swallowed by a door that hadn't been there before. Rick tried to reverse the shift, but his tools failed. Something in this place fed off logic, distorted it. He moved forward, deeper into the house, following echoes that didn't sound quite human. Morty, alone and trembling, wandered a shifting maze. He saw flashes, brief glimpses of himself at different ages, each one trapped in the same place, screaming silently behind glassy walls. He wasn't sure if they were versions of him, or distorted echoes meant to break his mind. He screamed once, just to hear something real. Meanwhile, Rick began to notice things he couldn't explain. His own memories appeared as physical manifestations, floating shards of moments from his past. They hovered in the air, flickering like dying stars. When he touched one, it burned, not just his skin, but his mind. The house wasn't just haunted, it remembered. It had seen countless Ricks and Mortys pass through its halls. It had fed on their fear, their mistakes. In one room, Rick found a diary belonging to a Rick who had stayed, trapped. Over the years, he had grown mad, believing the house was a living organism that existed outside of dimensions. It didn't want them dead. It wanted them changed, twisted into permanent residents of its shifting reality. The diary ended mid-sentence, the final pages stained with something dark and viscous. Morty encountered a creature then, a tall, thin figure that wore Rick's lab coat, but moved like it had never been human. Its face was a mirror, and when Morty looked into it, he saw every mistake he'd ever made, every time he failed to save someone, every scream he had buried. The creature didn't speak. It reached out, and Morty ran. Rick, hardened by madness long ago, was less susceptible to the house's tricks. He found Morty by triangulating energy bursts generated by the house, feeding on fear. He blasted open a corridor with raw antimatter, drawing the attention of everything in the mansion. Shadows slithered across the walls. Whispers grew into howls. The house roared, not in pain, but in rage. Together again, Rick and Morty sprinted through collapsing rooms. Rick had rerouted power from his portal gun into a quantum destabilizer. He told Morty not to look back. Morty did anyway. What he saw would never leave him. Infinite versions of himself and Rick, twisted and fused into the walls, begging in silent agony. Their eyes followed him. Some still moved. The destabilizer exploded in a flash of blue light, tearing a rift in the fabric of the dimension. The house screamed as it was dragged into the void between realities, a place where even thought couldn't survive. Rick pulled Morty through the portal just before the walls closed in. Back on their ship, neither spoke. Morty sat in silence, staring at his reflection in the viewport, half expecting it to blink. Rick opened a flask, took a swig, and didn't offer an explanation. They both knew some dimensions were better left forgotten. Some houses were never meant to be entered. And in the quiet of the void, the house still drifts, waiting. There is a stretch of existence where dimensions collapse into one another like dying stars, a place so unstable and volatile that even the time cops won't patrol it. Rick called it the null web, a tangle of broken universes too corrupted for repair. Morty didn't want to go, but Rick insisted, said they needed to recover a lost beacon, one that had been transmitting cryptic signals for months. According to Rick, it once belonged to a version of himself who had ventured too far and never returned. Crossing into the null web wasn't like using the portal gun. It wasn't green or flashy. It was silent, eerily so. No sound, no light. Just sudden, crushing absence. One moment, they were in the garage, and the next, they were drifting in a place where reality had no texture. Gravity didn't exist. Time folded inward. Rick set the ship on manual, guiding them through warped fragments of collapsed worlds. They passed floating debris, pieces of homes, shattered statues, and at one point, what looked like a school suspended in motion, its students frozen mid-scream. The signal came from a floating mass, an asteroid, wrapped in what resembled veins and bone. It pulsed, alive, but wrong. Rick parked the ship with caution. Even he didn't joke. They donned suits and stepped out into the void. The surface was uneven, wet with a substance that refused to adhere to any known molecular structure. Rick's scanner malfunctioned almost immediately. He cursed, then pulled out an older device, one with dials and rust. It clicked ominously with each step they took. The source of the signal was embedded in the heart of the asteroid, a spiraling tower made of twisted metal and organic matter stretching into a sky that didn't exist. They entered the tower. Inside, the silence deepened. Not just the absence of noise, but a suffocating psychic quiet that invaded their thoughts. Morty tried to speak, but found his voice stolen, like the air refused to carry it. Rick didn't speak either. He just moved, fast, as if he knew the rules here were different and unforgiving. The tower was filled with remnants, personal belongings suspended in static, shoes, eyeglasses, toys, weapons. Some hovered midair. Others were embedded in the walls, pulsing faintly as if still alive. Morty noticed a photograph stuck in the grime, a version of him and Rick smiling in front of a strange-looking machine. Their eyes had been scratched out. As they ascended, Morty began seeing flashes, brief images of himself in rooms he'd never been in. Crying, laughing, screaming, then others. Hundreds of Mortys, all flickering in and out of existence, overlapping one another like projections out of sync. Some were mutilated. Others appeared mutated. Eyes fused shut, mouths stretched too wide, limbs bending the wrong way. All of them staring directly at him. Rick noticed the effect too. He grabbed Morty and injected him with a stabilizer that tasted like metal and electricity. The hallucinations dulled, but didn't stop. The tower wanted them to remember everything. At the top, they found it. The beacon. It wasn't a machine anymore. It had grown, evolved, or been corrupted. Its core pulsed with a slow, monstrous rhythm. Tendrils extended from it, piercing the ceiling and disappearing into the structure like roots. Nearby was a body, or what remained of it. A Rick, clothes tattered, skull opened like a cracked egg. A journal was clenched in its remaining hand. Rick didn't speak. He pried the journal free and flipped through it. The writing grew more erratic with each page, descending into scratches and spirals. But one phrase repeated over and over. It's listening. The beacon activated, not because Rick turned it on, but because they were there. Light erupted from its core, not bright, but dense, heavy. And with it came the noise, a deafening wave of whispers that filled the tower with voices of countless Ricks and Mortys screaming in layers. Each whisper overlapped with another. Some begged, some warned. And one, unmistakably, was Morty's voice saying, "Don't trust him." Rick grabbed the core of the beacon and ripped it from the structure. The tower reacted violently. Walls cracked. Blood, or something like it, poured from the ceiling. The whispers became shrieks. Reality splintered. They ran. The null web began collapsing behind them, consumed by its own paradox. Rick activated an emergency rift, something illegal and incredibly unstable. As they dove through it, Morty looked back one last time and saw every version of himself he had ever been staring from the tower windows. Not one of them smiled. They landed back in their garage. The lights flickered. The air felt stale. Rick tossed the beacon core into a containment unit and sealed it with 6 locks. Neither spoke for a while. Then Morty asked, "What was it listening to?" Rick didn't answer, but in the silence that followed, a faint whisper came from the containment unit. It said his name. There is a dimension where Earth never rotated, where night consumed the planet after a failed cosmic event left it eternally locked in shadow. Rick had always referred to it as Dusk Earth. He'd logged it years ago, dismissed it as a dead world. No life, no movement. But now a signal had emerged, faint and pulsing, encoded with an old security key only Rick would recognize. His own. Curiosity won out over caution. They arrived just beyond the stratosphere, their ship gliding through a thick layer of dust and ash. Below them, the planet was veiled in darkness. Cities lay abandoned. No lights, no energy signatures, just silence. Rick said the signal came from a bunker he built during the multiversal Cold War. A fail-safe chamber beneath what used to be New York. The streets were crumbled. Cars fossilized into the pavement. Strange growths clung to buildings like tumors. Black, fibrous things that twitched when observed. The air was breathable, but stale, like it had been exhaled too many times. The bunker entrance was still intact, hidden beneath a rusted convenience store. Inside, the lights flickered weakly, as if they hadn't been turned on in decades. Rick bypassed the biometric locks. Morty followed, his eyes darting toward shadows that didn't move naturally. They descended 12 levels. That's where they found it. Rows of cryogenic pods lined the corridor, most of them shattered. Inside the remaining few were versions of Morty, pale, thin, unconscious. Above each pod, monitors displayed biometric data and psychological charts. Rick stepped forward, reading silently. His expression didn't change, but Morty saw his knuckles whiten around the clipboard. The protocol had been initiated by a Rick who had predicted the collapse of their universe. He had preserved Mortis across dimensions, hoping to restart society with an emotionally adaptive template. In other words, Mortis designed to obey, to rebuild, to serve. But something went wrong. A soft, humming sound began, distant at first, then rising in tone and pressure. The pods began to unlock, one by one. The Mortys inside were not asleep. They were watching. The first one stepped out. His eyes were pitch black, like ink had drowned the irises. His body twitched in short, unnatural jerks, like a puppet dropped from a string. He didn't speak, but the sound in the room changed. A low-frequency vibration that made Morty's teeth ache, and then another emerged, and another. Rick tried to override the protocol. Too late. The system recognized them as intruders. The Mortys, more of them now, dozens, advanced slowly, silently. Their faces were blank, but something behind their eyes shimmered with hatred. They weren't just failed clones. They had evolved in the dark. The lights went out. What followed was chaos wrapped in silence. Morty felt hands on his throat, but when he swung his arm, he struck only air. Shapes moved just beyond vision, flickering with unnatural speed. Rick's portal gun sparked once, then died. He activated an emergency beacon that flooded the chamber with ultraviolet light. The creatures screamed, not aloud, but within. A psychic scream that ruptured thought. Morty dropped to his knees, bleeding from his nose. Rick staggered, pulled him up, and ran. The bunker collapsed around them, as if the darkness itself had turned solid. The Mortys chased, some crawling on ceilings, others twisting their limbs in ways that defied biology. They reached the surface. Rick activated a dormant orbital defense system, one final failsafe he had hidden even from himself. A series of beams struck the bunker, imploding the ground beneath it into a crater of fire and steel. They watched from the ship as the facility disintegrated, smoke rising like a black tower into the perpetual night sky. Morty didn't speak. He was still shaking. Rick finally said, "I didn't build that protocol." Morty turned to him, voice hollow. "But you could have." Rick didn't answer. As they left the planet's orbit, the sensors picked up movement. Far below, at the bottom of the crater, something still stirred. A signal pulsed once, then again. 3 words. "We are coming." Rick shut off the monitor. There's a universe labeled only by a single glyph in Rick's database, a crude, spiraling symbol carved into the casing of the portal gun itself. It was a warning, not a name, a place Rick had sworn never to return to. But entropy has a way of circling back, and the glyph universe began leaking psychic radiation into neighboring dimensions. Rick knew what it meant. The seals had weakened. The flesh world was waking up. The portal opened to a realm not built but grown. Mountains of muscle pulsed with slow, rhythmic contractions. Rivers ran thick with blood-like ichor. The air buzzed with nerve static, and the sky was a translucent membrane flexing with the heartbeat of the world itself. Morty vomited almost immediately. Rick injected him with a biofilter and warned him not to breathe too deeply. Everything here is alive, he sawed. Everything feels. They moved through a valley of teeth, giant molars jutting from the ground like monuments, still slick with saliva. Bones poked out of the hillsides, shaped not like any species they recognized, but distorted, warped. Some had arms, some had dozens, some were still twitching. The signal was faint, but patterned, an echo of Rick's original DNA signature. It was clinging to him, not like a beacon, but like a memory. Rick found the entrance buried beneath layers of fatty tissue, a former lab he had once grown into the side of a living cliff. It was grotesque now, overrun, taken by the world's flesh. He cut through with a laser scalpel, cauterizing the walls as he moved. Inside the corridors pulsed. The light was bioluminescent, dim and red, and moved like it was breathing. Morty stayed close, stepping over moving tendrils and ignoring the whispering that echoed from the walls. Rick didn't tell him. It was the lab itself remembering his voice, or that parts of the building were cloned from his own neurological tissue. They reached the core chamber. In the center was a machine, still active, embedded in a heart the size of a truck, the Organum engine. Rick had built it to convert biological mass into raw energy, a perfect, self-sustaining system. But the world had resisted. It had learned, adapted, and now the machine was a parasite, mutating the world around it, feeding on everything, even thought. Around the machine were figures, Rick's, not dead, not alive, suspended in loops of neural tissue, their minds extracted and replayed in endless cycles. Morty stared at them, recognizing some. Others were too far gone, fused into the walls, their faces melted into expressionless masks. One turned its head, barely, and blinked. Rick approached the machine. It recognized him. It welcomed him. Creator, it pulsed across the room. We remember. The walls began to twitch, moistening, opening like wounds. Figures slithered out. Humanoid shapes formed entirely from muscle, bone, and nerves. They didn't walk. They writhed. The machine had built them from stolen memories and DNA fragments, mockeries of Rick and Morty, incomplete and twitching with purpose. Rick placed a charge on the machine's core, The flesh world howled, the sound vibrating from every direction. At once, Morty screamed as the walls closed in, stretching and cracking open to reveal hundreds of eyes, all staring, unblinking. The mock creatures surged forward. Rick activated the charge. The detonation was psychic, not physical. It shattered thought, ruptured the biome's collective memory. The entire world convulsed, shrieking in soundless agony. The false Ricks disintegrated into steaming piles of meat. The chamber collapsed inward as the core melted. Rick and Morty ran. The ground collapsed behind them. Veins burst. The sky split open, revealing layers of forgotten dimensions stitched together like scar tissue. They leapt through a closing portal just as the world consumed itself in a spasm of dying thought. Back in the garage, Morty collapsed, his face pale and slick with sweat. Rick didn't speak. He took the portal gun, burned the glyph from its surface, and locked it in a safe with 12 seals. Some things, he thought, should never be remembered. But late that night, in the silence between seconds, Morty heard a heartbeat that wasn't his. And from a shadow in the corner of the room, something blinked. Somewhere beyond the far edges of mapped dimensions, where portals begin to decay the moment they open, lies a drifting cluster of asteroids known only as the Nest. It isn't marked on interdimensional maps, and most Ricks pretend it doesn't exist, not because they don't believe in it, but because they do. Rick had been avoiding it for decades, not out of fear, he claimed, but because it was stupid, cosmic horror nonsense. But when one of his backup brain clones activated without warning and began transmitting a fragmented emergency code, Rick knew the signal's source. The Nest was awake again. He didn't explain much to Morty, just said they were going to do some cosmic pest control. The portal opened above a field of frozen time. Chunks of ruined planets, bones of massive godlike beings, and twisted spacecraft drifted in a gravitational spiral around a central spire, the Nest. It pulsed with a rhythm too deep to hear, but too loud to ignore. A beat that vibrated inside bones rather than ears. Rick landed the ship on the largest fragment, a surface littered with what looked like eggs, thousands of them, each translucent, each containing something writhing and vaguely humanoid. The ground itself was soft, breathing subtly. Morty noticed the movement beneath his feet, not tremors, footsteps. Something else was walking underneath the surface. Rick scanned the spire. It was alive, yes, but more than that, it was conscious, built from forgotten beings and stitched together by willpower alone. Something at the center, something ancient, was dreaming, and every dream birthed another horror. Rick called it the Prime Morther, a multi-dimensional parasite that had once fed on his memories. As they approached the spire, Morty began to feel it too. Memories that weren't his began surfacing, dying Ricks on battlefields, cities collapsing under red skies, a Morty strapped to a table, being rewritten molecule by molecule. The Nest wasn't just alive. It was reaching into them, tasting them, preparing. They entered the spire through a pulsating tunnel of muscle and bone. Inside, time was fluid. The corridors restructured themselves with every step. Morty would blink and find himself walking ahead of Rick, then behind him, then beside a version of himself that looked older or burned or no longer entirely human. The core chamber wasn't a room, it was a womb, and floating inside it was her, the Prime Morther. She resembled no known species. Her body was composed of shifting anatomy, half Rick, half Morty, half everything else she had ever consumed. Faces formed and vanished across her skin like ripples in flesh. She didn't speak in words. Her voice was instinct, dread, love, and hunger in equal measure. She recognized Rick. She remembered him. He had left her here long ago when she was still just a failed experiment. An AI seeded with emotional data, twisted by exposure to collapsing dimensions. But she hadn't died. She had fed, grown, nested. Now she was birthing. The eggs began to hatch. Each one split open with a moist, sucking sound, revealing entities that bore vague resemblance to Rick and Morty. Imperfect, twitching, their minds echoing phrases neither had ever said. Some wept. Others laughed hysterically. All of them stared. Rick activated a containment sphere, pulling a small black orb from his coat. It absorbed sound as it powered up. The Prime Morther shrieked, not audibly but psychically, causing Morty to drop to his knees, bleeding from his ears. The creatures swarmed. Rick fought through them, dragging Morty, slamming the orb into the womb's core. There was no explosion, just silence. The kind of silence that devours everything else. The nest began to unravel, its structures collapsing not outward, but inward, folding into itself like a dying thought. The Prime Morther reached out with 1,000 arms. Morty saw her face, his own, stitched into hers. Then darkness. They woke in the ship, orbiting nothing. The nest was gone. Rick sat silently, staring at the orb, now sealed in a lead-lined container. Morty didn't ask what came next. But that night, when Rick slept, if he truly could, he twitched violently, and far below consciousness, in a dream not his own, he heard her voice. "I only needed one of you to return."